Imagine you are standing in the middle of the African savanna. The sun is setting, the grass is tall, and somewhere out there, in the shadows of the highlands, something massive is watching you. Not a lion, not an elephant, something that walks on two legs, something that can tear a full-grown crocodile apart with its bare hands. Now here is the question that is going to keep you watching this entire video. What if the ancient peoples of Africa, thousands of years before Egypt, before Rome, before any empire we were taught about in school, actually fought a war against beings so enormous, so terrifying, that the memory of it was almost completely erased from history? Not erased by time, erased on purpose. I want you to stop for just 1 second and think about this. Right now, the Bible, most of us know, has 66 books. 66! That's the version approved by the Roman Empire. But walk into any ancient monastery carved into the cliffs of Ethiopia, and they will hand you a Bible with 81 books. 81! 15 entire books that the rest of the world was never supposed to read. One of those books is called the Book of Enoch, and inside the Book of Enoch is a detailed, systematic account of a race of giants that once walked this earth, their origins, their behavior, and the war that was waged against them. Now I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like mythology, but stay with me, because what we are going to explore today is not just ancient storytelling. It is backed by archaeological findings, ancient manuscripts that survived for thousands of years, and oral traditions from multiple African civilizations that all describe the same thing, independently. That is not mythology. That is history that someone did not want you to find. So today, we're going inside the story the world forgot, the forgotten war against the Nephilim giants of Africa. Drop a comment right now. Did your school ever teach you that the Ethiopian Bible has 15 more books than the Western one? Because mine didn't. To understand this war, we have to go back to the very beginning. The Book of Enoch, one of the oldest written texts ever discovered, describes a group of celestial beings called the Watchers. These were not ordinary angels in the way most people imagine them. The text describes them as a class of beings assigned to observe humanity, to watch, to guard. But somewhere along the way, something changed. According to the Book of Enoch, 200 of these watchers made a decision. They descended. They chose to leave their assigned domain and come down to Earth. The manuscript records this event with a level of geographic specificity that historians find remarkable. It mentions a location called Mount Hermon, a real mountain that sits today on the border between Syria and Lebanon. The text even records their names, Semjaza, Azazel, names that appear across multiple ancient cultural traditions. Now here's where it gets historically significant. The Watchers did not come down and disappear into obscurity. According to Enoch, the Nephilim began interacting with human populations, and from those interactions came offspring. The text calls them Nephilim. The word Nephilim appears directly in the book of Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. It is one of the few passages that has survived every council, every censorship, every edit throughout history. And even there, in the most widely read book in the world, the text admits that these beings existed. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. But what Genesis barely mentions, the Book of Enoch describes in full detail. These Nephilim were massive. The ancient text places their height in figures that scholars still debate today, but the consistent theme across every version is undeniable. These beings were of a size that made normal humans look like children. And they were not mindless creatures. That's what makes this story so terrifying. They were intelligent, they organized, they hunted. Now, as the northern territories became increasingly hostile to their existence, ancient records suggest that large groups of Nephilim began moving south, down through the Levant, down through the Nile corridor, and deep into the heart of the African continent. This is where the story gets personal. This is where the people of Africa enter the fight. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine you are a Kushite commander. Your people have built one of the most advanced early civilizations in the Nile Valley. You are a military leader. You have faced lions. You have faced enemy armies. Nothing scares you. And then, one morning, your scouts return from the highlands with faces drained of color. They cannot speak. They can barely breathe. And when they finally find words, they tell you what they saw. A creature, shaped like a man, standing in the river at the edge of the forest. It reached down, grabbed a Nile crocodile, an animal that can weigh over 1,000 pounds, and simply tore it apart, with its hands, like you or I would tear a piece of bread. This account is preserved in various forms across ancient Kushite oral traditions. Scholars who have studied these traditions note a remarkable consistency in the descriptions. The beings were enormous, they communicated, and they specifically targeted human settlements. One of the recurring figures in these stories carries a name that translates roughly to Kepha, a term associated with a commander or military guardian. The legend describes how Kepha gathered his men after the first sighting and tried to track the giant. They found its footprints. Each print was the size of a warrior's entire torso. The Kushite oral tradition records that entire villages began disappearing, not just people, livestock, storage units, entire structures, gone overnight, and the warriors sent to investigate never came back. Now here's a detail that appears across multiple African traditions and that historians find particularly compelling. The people who survived close encounters described one consistent observation. These beings bled. They were enormous, they were powerful, they seemed almost impossible to kill, but they bled. And that single observation, that moment of recognition, is what changed everything. Because if it bleeds, it can be killed. It might just require a different kind of weapon. Let me ask you this. If you lived in that era, with only the tools available then, how would you fight something 10 times your size? Leave your answer in the comments. Seriously, I want to know. What happened next in the historical and oral record is one of the most extraordinary stories of human adaptation ever documented. The people of ancient Africa did not collapse. They did not surrender. They organized. For the first time in recorded oral history of the region, multiple rival tribal groups, people who had fought each other for generations over water rights, grazing land, and territory, sat down together. The Kushite peoples of the Nile Valley, the Nilotic tribes of the Great Plains, the highland communities of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. 3 distinct cultural groups with entirely different languages and traditions united by a single threat. This kind of alliance in early human history is not just remarkable, it is extraordinary. Anthropologists who study pre-state societies in Africa note that cross-tribal military alliances of this scale are almost unheard of without the presence of a catastrophic external threat. Something forced these people together, and whatever it was, they took the fight seriously. The first major shift in strategy was psychological. They stopped thinking like warriors and started thinking like hunters. A warrior faces the enemy directly. A hunter uses terrain, patience, and intelligence. The highlands of Ethiopia and the Great Rift Valley region offered something invaluable: geography. Deep canyon systems, narrow gorge passages, cliffs that rose hundreds of feet. The human body is small, but in the right terrain, small becomes an advantage. Ancient oral traditions from the region describe elaborate trap systems. Warriors would lure the giants toward specific corridors, narrow mountain passes, where the sheer size of the Nephilim became a liability rather than an asset. But traps alone were not enough. This is where the botanical knowledge of these ancient African civilizations becomes historically significant. Modern pharmacological research has confirmed that the forests of sub-Saharan Africa contain some of the most potent natural compounds on Earth. Many of these have been used by indigenous communities for thousands of years. Ancient oral traditions from this era describe specific plant-based preparations applied to weapons, substances capable of disrupting cardiovascular function and breaking down tissue, even in exceptionally large biological systems. One figure appears repeatedly in the oral traditions of multiple communities across this region, a hunter referred to in translations as Sifue, a name associated in the linguistic traditions with the concept of the one who sets the path, in other words, a strategist. The traditions describe Sifue as the architect of what became the defining military innovation of this era, a canyon trap system. The idea was to position teams of hunters at the top of cliff formations surrounding a narrow valley. The giants would be drawn in by decoys, sound, fire, or movement. Once inside the canyon, the hunters above would trigger a collapse, hundreds of tons of rock, piled, positioned, and ready. The traditions describe this strategy being used multiple times with devastating effect. Here is a question worth debating. Do you think ancient African civilizations are underrepresented in mainstream historical education? Comment below. I read every single one. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that most people are completely unprepared for, because the Nephilim did not remain nomadic predators forever. At some point in the archaeological and traditional record, the pattern changes. They stopped moving. They started building. The highlands of Ethiopia and the surrounding regions contain some of the most puzzling megalithic structures in the world, massive arrangements of stone, formations that, when examined by archaeologists, raise serious questions about who built them and how. The Aksumite civilization, one of the greatest ancient empires in history, and one that is still criminally underrepresented in Western education, later built their famous obelisks in this same region. But beneath the Aksumite layers, and beneath even older strata, archaeologists have found evidence of earlier construction activity that does not fit any known human culture of the corresponding era. Stones moved and stacked in patterns that suggest an understanding of weight distribution and structural engineering, formations too large for any conventional early human workforce to have accomplished with known tools. Now, I want to be clear here. This is an area of genuine academic debate. There are mainstream archaeologists who argue these structures can be explained through conventional means, and there are researchers who argue the evidence points towards something we do not yet fully understand. What the ancient oral traditions of the region claim is this, that the Nephilim, as they established dominance over the highlands, began creating permanent strongholds, fixed bases, and that they used these bases to organize. The oral traditions describe something that translates in multiple linguistic traditions as the Gate of Bones, a structure, an entrance built from the remains of animals and humans to serve as both a practical barrier and a psychological weapon, a warning to any community that approached. The message was simple: turn back or join what is already here. And this is perhaps the most chilling development in the entire record, because it means the Nephilim were no longer just predators. They had become something more sophisticated, something more dangerous. They had become architects of a kingdom. They had leaders, they communicated strategy, and they had learned from their encounters with human hunters. They had begun to adapt to the traps. Think about that for a moment. The thing hunting you is learning how you hunt it. At some point in the oral tradition, and this is the part that ancient storytellers across multiple cultures describe with the greatest level of detail and the greatest degree of emotional weight, the allied tribes made a decision. No more defensive strategies, no more waiting. They were going in. The traditions describe a massive coordinated assault on the primary highland stronghold. Every available fighter from the allied tribes, equipped with everything they had developed, the traps, the weapons, the botanical compounds, moving together, in the dark, toward the heart of the Nephilim kingdom. The initial assault, according to the traditions, was devastating, but not in the way the hunters expected. They had prepared for giants. They had not prepared for what was waiting deeper inside. The oral traditions from multiple independent sources describe an encounter in the deeper chambers of the cave system beneath the stronghold. The accounts vary in their specific details, which is actually what gives them a degree of historical credibility, because independent traditions rarely fabricate the same unique details. But across multiple sources, certain elements remain constant. A being of significantly greater age and size than the Nephilim themselves, a presence that the traditions associate with the original fallen watchers rather than their offspring, something ancient, something that had been waiting in the dark long before the battle began. Now, I want to anchor this in historical context because this is where the archaeological record becomes relevant. Multiple cave systems in the Ethiopian highlands contain ancient inscriptions and pictographic records. Some of these have been dated to pre-Aksumite periods, and some of them depict battles, multi-figure conflict scenes with size differentials between the combatants that are difficult to explain through ordinary interpretation. One warrior in the oral tradition is given a name that translates as Dan, associated in the linguistic tradition with the concept of justice or judgment. The traditions describe Dan as the one who drew the creature furthest into the prepared kill zone, who held the line while others activated the collapse system, who did not walk out of that cave. The traditions do not describe Dan as a victim, they describe him as a weapon, a man who chose to become the final trigger of the trap. Entire communities across this region still carry commemorative traditions tied to figures like Dan, oral histories that celebrate not just the victory, but the cost of it. This raises a question I genuinely want your thoughts on. Do you think there are ancient African heroes whose stories deserve the same global recognition as figures like Achilles or Leonidas? Because the historical case for that is overwhelming. The oral traditions from multiple African civilizations describe the culmination of this war not as a military victory alone, but as a convergence, a moment when the actions of humanity and the actions of something far greater aligned. After generations of warfare, after the canyon traps and the botanical weapons and the cave assaults, after an untold number of lives sacrificed on both sides, the traditions describe the sky changing. Now, the Great Flood is one of the most cross-culturally documented events in all of human oral history. Virtually every major ancient civilization on Earth has a version of it. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hindu Manu traditions, indigenous oral histories from the Americas, African traditions from dozens of distinct cultural groups. The consistency of this cross-cultural record is something that mainstream historians acknowledge as significant. The specific details vary, but the core event, a catastrophic global water event that reshaped the world, appears in nearly every tradition humanity has ever produced.
The Book of Enoch does not describe the flood as a random natural disaster. It describes it as a response, a deliberate act aimed specifically at undoing what the Watchers had done to the genetic and social fabric of the human world. And here is the archaeological dimension that modern science has actually begun to examine seriously. At various sites across the African continent, researchers have found evidence of massive prehistoric flooding events, sediment layers, erosion patterns, geological formations that suggest water events of a scale difficult to explain through ordinary climate variation alone. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the Titanic, conducted research at the bottom of the Black Sea. His team found evidence of a catastrophic ancient flood event that, at the time it occurred, would have inundated enormous areas of what was previously dry, inhabited land. The highlands of Ethiopia are among the highest elevated landmasses on the continent. They are, in many ways, precisely the kind of geography where survivors of a catastrophic water event might have retreated, or where records of such an event might have survived. And this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the question that ties everything together. Why don't we know about any of this? In 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine convened what became known as the Council of Nicaea. It was one of the most consequential meetings in the history of Western civilization. Among the many decisions made at that council was a determination about which texts would constitute the official Christian canon. In other words, which books made the cut and which ones did not. The Book of Enoch did not make the cut. Now, the reasons given by early church fathers for this exclusion are complex and debated by religious historians to this day. Some argued the text was too speculative. Others raised questions of authorship. But the timing and specificity of what was excluded is something that historians who study religious censorship find remarkable. The texts that were removed most aggressively were precisely those that contained the most detailed accounts of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the pre-flood world: the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Giants, a text whose fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming it once existed and circulated widely. These were not obscure documents. In the early centuries of the Common Era, the Book of Enoch was widely read and widely cited. Early church fathers, including Tertullian and Irenaeus, referenced it as legitimate scripture. It was part of mainstream religious thought, and then it was removed. There is one major exception. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, established in the 4th century, making it one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, never accepted Rome's editorial decisions. They maintained their own canon, and in that canon, the Book of Enoch remains, to this day, required scripture, not supplementary reading, required. The monasteries of Ethiopia, particularly those in the Tigray region, built literally into cliff faces hundreds of feet above the ground, have served as the physical guardians of these texts for over a millennium. During invasions, during colonial pressures, during wars that destroyed most of the surrounding civilization, these monasteries held, and the texts inside them survived. The Debre Damo Monastery, Abuna Yamata Gu, Debre Bizen, these are not tourist attractions. They are archives, living libraries of a historical record that the rest of the world was told did not exist. Now, here is where I want to leave you with something to think about. Across the highlands of Ethiopia, archaeologists continue to uncover structures that do not fit neatly into conventional historical timelines. Foundations of buildings so large they predate any known civilization in the region. Burial sites with skeletal remains that have prompted serious academic debate about size and morphology. Ancient rock carvings depicting conflicts between figures of dramatically different scale. None of this is fabricated. These are documented finds. Most of them are simply not covered by mainstream media, because they do not fit the standard narrative, because fitting them into the standard narrative requires asking questions that mainstream institutions are not yet prepared to answer. Let me ask you directly, do you think there is important ancient African history that is being systematically overlooked by Western academia, not as a conspiracy, but simply as a failure of attention and priority? Tell me in the comments. That conversation matters. So, let us bring this full circle. Thousands of years ago, in the highlands and valleys of ancient Africa, something happened. Something that the people who lived through it considered significant enough to preserve through every means available to them. Oral tradition, cave inscription, manuscript, and ultimately through the careful stewardship of monasteries that have endured for over 1,000 years. What exactly that something was, whether it fits the precise descriptions in the Book of Enoch, or whether the ancient records represent a different kind of historical reality that our modern frameworks are still learning to interpret, is a question that honest historians acknowledge remains open. But what is not open to debate is this: the Book of Enoch exists. It is ancient, it is specific,
and it was removed from the Western canon by political and institutional decision, not because its existence was disputed. The Ethiopian biblical tradition exists. It has preserved texts for millennia that the rest of the world discarded, and those texts contain historical accounts that align in remarkable ways with archaeological evidence emerging from the African continent. The ancient oral traditions of Kushite, Nilotic, and Ethiopian highland civilizations exist. They describe independently, across multiple cultural groups, encounters with beings of extraordinary size, military strategies developed to fight them, heroes who gave their lives in that fight, and a world that was ultimately transformed by a catastrophic water event that erased most of the physical evidence. These three streams of evidence do not prove everything the legends claim, but they prove that the legends themselves are anchored in something real, in a human experience so profound that multiple civilizations spent thousands of years preserving its memory. And perhaps the most important thing they prove is this: the people of ancient Africa were not passive inhabitants of their continent. They were warriors, strategists, scientists, survivors. They fought battles that we cannot even fully imagine, with tools we are only beginning to understand, against enemies that defied every expectation of what an enemy could be. That story deserves to be told. That story deserves to be heard. And the fact that most of us have never heard it is itself a part of the story. If this video opened your eyes to something you had never considered before, please share it. Not because of the views, but because the people who preserved these records for thousands of years did it so that someday someone would listen. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into forgotten chapters of African history, and leave a comment telling me what is the ancient African civilization or story that you think deserves the most attention, because we are just getting started.